The sun hammered down on the Wyoming territory with the weight of an iron anvil, flattening the world into a haze of shimmering heat and dust. It was high noon, and the land looked as though it had been baked in a kiln. The earth cracked into a mosaic of thirsty fissures that begged for water it had not tasted in months. Dust devils, tall and spindly, danced across the flats like ghosts of forgotten giants, twisting sagebrush and grit into the air before collapsing back into nothingness. Far to the west, over the jagged spine of the mountains, dark clouds were beginning to bruise the sky, purple and swollen, but here in the basin, the air remained heavy, still, and suffocatingly dry. A solitary wagon train moved through this desolation, a slow crawling snake of canvas and timber. The wheels groaned against the rocks, a rhythmic protest that echoed off the walls of the dry wash they were navigating. The oxen had their heads low, tongues lolling, their hooves kicking up puffs of alkali dust that coated the travelers in a fine, gray powder. In the back of the second wagon, Clara sat on a wooden crate, her body swaying with every jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels. She was 19 years old, though the shadows under her eyes made her look older. She wore a dress of calico, faded to a nondescript blue, mended so carefully that the stitches looked like tiny scars across the fabric. Her hands were folded in her lap, clutching a small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief. Inside were the only things she truly owned: a silver locket with no picture inside, a comb made of bone, and a ribbon her mother had worn on her wedding day. Clara adjusted her sleeves, wincing slightly. Beneath the cuffs, her wrists were raw and chafed. The ribbon tied there was not for decoration, but had been used to bind her hands the night before, a precaution taken by her stepfather to ensure she did not run off into the darkness while the camp slept. He had untied her this morning, but the phantom weight of the restraint remained. She stared out the back of the wagon, watching the tracks they left behind, feeling as though every turn of the wheel was winding a rope tighter around her chest. She was being delivered. That was the only word for it. Up on the driver's bench, the voices of men drifted back to her, loud and grating against the silence of the plains. Silas Vance, her stepfather, was in high spirits despite the oppressive heat. He was a man of nervous energy, always sweating, with eyes that darted around as if looking for a coin someone might have dropped. Beside him rode Mr. Branson, on a black gelding that looked too fine for this rough country. Mr. Branson was the storekeeper in the town of Oakhaven, a man of 50 with a belly that strained his waistcoat and hands that were soft and white like rising dough. "You have made a fine choice." "Mr. Branson," Silas shouted, his voice cracking with an eagerness that made Clara's stomach turn. "She is a quiet thing, obedient. I have raised her to know her place. You will not find a girl with a purer reputation this side of the Mississippi." Branson grunted, shifting his weight in the saddle. He turned his head, his gaze bypassing Silas to peer into the shadowed interior of the wagon. Clara felt his eyes on her, heavy and possessive, like he was inspecting a sack of flour for weevils. "She looks sturdy enough?" Branson said, his voice thick. "I need a woman who can work the store and keep the house. My last wife was frail. Cost me a fortune in doctor bills before she finally passed. I trust this one is stronger, strong as a mule and twice as meek," Silas promised, laughing at his own wit. "She will give you no trouble, and the dowry chest is heavy, as agreed. You are getting the better end of the deal, sir." Clara tightened her grip on her bundle. She was part of the transaction, thrown in to sweeten the pot, a laborer who would share his bed and bear his children in exchange for Silas's debts being wiped clean. She had tried to argue. Weeks ago, when the arrangement was first made, Silas had struck her across the face, a casual violence that ended the conversation. Since then, she had not spoken a word of protest. The wagon train began to descend deeper into the arroyo, a wide, sandy cut in the earth carved by ancient waters. The walls rose up on either side, steep banks of red dirt and exposed root. It was cooler down here, in the shadow of the cut, but the air felt thin, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Clara's arms stand up. As they reached the bottom of the wash, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them. They were cowboys, rough-looking men with dust in their beards and rifles scabbarded on their saddles. They pulled their horses up short, looking down at the wagons. One of them, a man with a scarred nose, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted down, "You best turn back," he yelled. "Look at those peaks!" Silas pulled back on the reins, halting the team. He looked up, squinting against the glare. "What is it?" he shouted back. "Rain coming," the cowboy called, pointing toward the distant mountains where the purple clouds had turned a bruised black. "Big storm up high. This wash is a death trap if the water comes down. You need to get to high ground. Mr. Branson trotted his horse closer to the wagon. "Nonsense," he spat. "The sky is clear right here. We have a schedule to keep. Vance, I want to be in Oakhaven by sundown tomorrow. If we turn back or circle around to the ridge, we lose half a day." Silas looked from the cowboys to Branson, his greed weighing the risk. He looked at the sky directly above them, which was a pale, innocent blue. "Those boys are just trying to spook us," Silas said, sneering. "We can make it through the cut in 2 hours. We will push the horses." The cowboy on the ridge shook his head, spitting on the ground in disgust. "It is your funeral, mister," he shouted, then turned his horse and rode away, his companions following. "Make good time," Silas shouted to the other drivers, cracking his whip over the oxen's backs. "Keep them moving." The wagons lurched forward, the wheels sinking slightly into the soft sand of the wash floor. Clara felt a shiver run through her. Despite the heat, she looked up at the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. It felt like the lid of a box closing. 5 miles to the north, on a ridge that overlooked the sprawling network of gullies and canyons. Luke sat astride his bay horse. He was a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself, lean and hard, with a face weathered by wind and sun into a permanent expression of wariness. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that were the color of flint, and his hands, resting on the saddle horn, were scarred and capable. He was driving a small string of cattle, stragglers he had pulled from the brush, but he had stopped them now. The cattle were restless, lowing and pawing at the dirt. Animals knew before men did. Luke watched the horizon. The storm over the mountains was not just a rain shower. It was a deluge. He could see the gray curtains of rain falling miles away, thick and heavy sheets that obliterated the peaks. It was the kind of sudden, violent storm that the high desert was famous for, a cloudburst that dropped months of rain in an hour onto ground too hard to absorb it. "Fools," Luke muttered, thinking of the wagon tracks he had seen earlier, heading toward the low ground. He took a sip from his canteen, the water warm and tasting of tin. People came out here from the east thinking the land was just scenery. They did not understand that the land was a living thing, indifferent to their schedules and their desires. It would kill them without malice, simply because they were in the way. The first drop of rain hit the back of his hand, fat and cold. It hit the dust with a soft hiss, then another, then the sky seemed to tear open. But the rain falling on him was not the danger. The danger was what was happening miles uphill. The water was gathering. It was sliding off the slate rocks, pooling in the ravines, joining together, finding the path of least resistance. It was building a muscle of mud and timber, gravity pulling it down, faster and faster, toward the dry veins of the low country. Luke turned his horse, intending to ride for the shelter of a rock overhang he knew. But then he paused. From his vantage point, he could see the distant dust of the wagon train, a tiny crawling line in the deep scar of the arroyo. They were right in the throat of it. He swore softly, a sharp, bitter word. He owed no man anything. He had learned the hard way that helping others usually resulted in a knife in the back or a rope around the neck. But he watched the dark stain of water beginning to rush through the distant gullies, moving with terrifying speed, heading for the main channel. "Move," he told his horse, spurring the bay forward. He did not ride away from the danger. He rode parallel to the wash, guiding the horse down the treacherous slope of loose shale, his eyes fixed on the wagons below. In the arroyo, the air had changed. The stillness was gone, replaced by a sudden, cold wind that whipped dust into the traveler's eyes. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. The oxen began to toss their heads, fighting the yokes, their eyes rolling with instinctual fear. Silas whipped them harder. "Get on, you useless beasts!" he screamed, his voice thin against the rising wind. Clara stood up in the back of the wagon, holding onto the canvas hoop. A sound was coming from up the canyon. It started as a low vibration, something she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it with her ears. It sounded like a freight train, or like the earth itself was grinding its teeth. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Mister." Branson had stopped his horse. He was looking back the way they had come, his face draining of color. "Jesus Almighty," he whispered. The roar grew louder, becoming a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. It was a chaotic, churning noise, the sound of boulders smashing together, of trees snapping like matchsticks. "Drive!" Branson screamed, wheeling his horse around. "Drive for the bank!" But the banks here were steep and crumbly. There was nowhere to go. The wall of water came around the bend like a monster from a nightmare. It was not blue, and it was not clean. It was a churning, boiling mass of chocolate-brown mud. 10 feet high, topped with a crest of dirty foam and carrying whole cottonwood trees, dead cattle, and jagged rocks. It moved with a speed that defied logic, devouring the dry ground. Panic exploded. The drivers lashed their teams into a frenzy. The wagons lurched violently as the animals tried to scramble up the loose scree of the canyon walls. Clara was thrown off balance as the wagon slammed into a boulder. She grabbed the side, her knuckles white. Silas was shouting incoherently, slashing the whip at the horses, ignoring the path, just trying to get higher. "Get out!" Silas screamed. "Lighten the load!" He looked back at the wagon bed. There were 2 large trunks there, the dowry, filled with linens, silver, and the gold coins Branson had paid him as a distinct, private bribe. And there was Clara. The wagon was slipping, the back wheels sliding toward the center of the channel where the water was seconds away from striking. The oxen could not pull the weight up the slope. Silas looked at the trunks. He looked at Clara. "Help me!" Clara cried, reaching a hand toward him. The wagon tilted precariously. Silas's eyes were wide with terror and a cold, calculating selfishness. He grabbed the handle of the trunk nearest him, bracing it so it wouldn't slide out. Then he looked at Clara, who was scrambling to climb over the seat to safety. "You are too slow!" he shrieked. He shoved her. It was not a gentle push. He planted his hand on her shoulder and thrust her backward with all his strength. Clara gasped, her feet slipping on the tilting floorboards. Her hem caught on a splintered edge of the wood. She fell backward, tumbling out of the rear of the wagon just as the water arrived. Silas whipped the horses one last time. Freed of her weight and with a surge of adrenaline, the oxen found purchase, dragging the wagon up the bank just mere feet above the flood line. "Swim, girl!" Silas screamed over his shoulder, his voice lost in the roar. Clara hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her. Before she could stand, the world turned brown and cold. The water hit her like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just water, it was a slurry of grit and power. It picked her up and tossed her like a rag doll. She opened her mouth to scream, and the river rushed in, tasting of mud and rot. She was tumbling, spinning, no longer knowing which way was up. Something hard struck her hip, a floating log, and pain shot through her body. She clawed at the water, her fingers scraping against passing debris, her vision blurred, filled only with the churning darkness. She was going to die. She was going to die here, abandoned, sold and then discarded like refuse. Luke saw it all from the slope above. He saw the wagon lurch, saw the man shove the girl, saw her fall into the path of the torrent. "Damn you!" he hissed, a curse directed at the man on the wagon. The flood was a raging snake now, filling the canyon floor. The girl was a small, dark shape bobbing in the violence of the current, swept downstream at a terrifying pace. She was fighting. He could see that. A pale arm reached up, grasping at the air, before being pulled under again. Luke did not think. He did not calculate the risk. He spurred the bay horse down the final stretch of the slope, sliding in a shower of loose stones, "Yeah," he shouted, driving the horse toward the edge of the water. The bay balked, smelling the death in the water, dancing sideways. Luke reined him in hard, his voice dropping to a command that brooked no argument. "Steady." He saw the girl surface again, 50 yards downstream. She had snagged on the branch of a submerged deadfall, the water piling up behind her, threatening to rip her loose at any second. Luke rode into the shallows. The water grabbed at the horse's legs, powerful and freezing. He uncoiled his lariat, but there was too much brush, too much debris. A rope would just tangle or strangle her. He had to get to her. He pushed the horse deeper until the water swirled around his boots. The current was deafening. He was parallel to her now. "Hold on," he roared, though he doubted she could hear him. He kicked his boots free of the stirrups. A dangerous move, but if the horse went down, he didn't want to be dragged with it. He guided the horse toward the deadfall. The water surged over the saddle. The horse was swimming now, fighting the lateral push of the flood. Clara was slipping. Her fingers, numb and battered, were losing their grip on the slippery bark of the branch. She looked up, her eyes wide and vacant with shock, seeing nothing but the angry sky. Luke leaned far out of the saddle, wrapping one leg around the horn for leverage. "Reach!" he shouted. "Give me your hand." Clara blinked, seeing a shape looming over her. A man, a horse. It seemed like a hallucination. "Now," Luke commanded. She let go of the branch with one hand and reached up blindly. Luke lunged, his hand, rough and calloused, clamped around her wrist like a manacle. The connection was solid. Luke groaned with the effort, the strain tearing at his shoulder as the current tried to take her. He hauled back, using the horse's momentum. "Back!" he shouted to the horse. "Back!" The bay struggled, hooves finding momentary purchase on a submerged rock, then churning through the mud. Luke dragged Clara through the water, pulling her up against the side of the horse. He grabbed the back of her dress with his other hand, hauling her dead weight up until she was draped over the front of the saddle. The horse surged, lunging for the bank. They scrambled up the muddy slope, sliding back, then lunging again, until finally they broke free of the water's grip. Luke steered them toward a stand of cottonwood trees on high ground, well above the flood line. He slid from the saddle, his knees buckling slightly from the adrenaline dump. He reached up and pulled Clara down. She was limp, coughing up water, her body shuddering violently. He laid her on the ground, on a patch of dry grass beneath the trees. She was a pitiable sight, her dress plastered to her skin, muddy hair covering her face, one shoe missing. Clara rolled onto her side, retching, expelling the river water from her lungs. She gasped for air, dragging it in with sobbing, ragged breaths. Luke stood over her, breathing hard himself. He looked down at the wash. The water was still rising, a chaotic mess of destruction. If he had been 30 seconds later, she would have been buried under tons of mud. He looked upstream. On the far bank, high up on the ridge, he saw the wagons. They were moving. They were continuing on. He watched for a moment, waiting to see a rider turn back, waiting to see someone stop and look for the girl. But the wagons kept moving, shrinking into the distance, putting as much space as possible between themselves and the disaster. "They left you," Luke said quietly. The words were lost in the wind, but the truth of them hung heavy in the air. Clara pushed herself up to a sitting position, her arms wrapping around her torso. She was freezing, her teeth chattering so hard it sounded like bones rattling in a cup. She looked around wildly, her eyes unfocused. My bundle," she stammered, her voice a broken croak. "I dropped my bundle." Luke looked at her. She was nearly drowned, likely bruised and battered, and she was worried about a bundle. He unbuckled his slicker, a heavy, oil-treated canvas coat, and took it off. He knelt beside her and draped it over her shoulders. "It is gone." "Miss," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "It is all gone." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him. He was wet, his hat dripping, his face grim. But he was solid. He was there. She grabbed the lapels of his slicker, pulling it tight around her, And then, as the shock began to crack open into true terror, she lunged forward, burying her face in his chest. Her fingers dug into his wet shirt, clutching him with a desperation that spoke of a lifetime of falling. Luke hesitated. He was not a man who held people. He was a man who lived alone, who kept his fences mended and his heart guarded. But he felt the tremors racking her small frame. He felt the absolute solitude of her position. He raised his hands slowly and wrapped them around her, holding her close against the biting wind. "I have got you," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "You are safe now." The rain began to fall harder, washing the mud from their faces, as the last of the wagon train disappeared over the horizon, leaving them alone in the vast, uncaring west. The sky to the west was bruising purple again, the color of a fresh hematoma, and the wind had teeth. It bit through Luke's soaked shirt and slicker, carrying the metallic scent of more rain. He looked down at the woman shivering in his arms. She was a small, fragile weight against the vast indifference of the plains. Her lips blue, her skin as pale as fresh milk. He could feel the tremors racking her body, a relentless shaking that rattled her very bones. He could not leave her here. The cottonwoods offered shelter from the wind, but the ground was sodden, and if the temperature dropped after sundown, which it surely would, the cold would finish what the flood had started. Luke mounted the bay horse with a grunt of effort, swinging his leg over the saddle while keeping one arm clamped firmly around Clara. He settled her in front of him, sideways across the pommel, cradling her head against his shoulder. She was barely conscious, her eyes rolling back, a low moan escaping her throat as the movement jarred her battered body. "Easy now," Luke murmured, though he was speaking as much to the horse as to her. "We have a ride ahead of us?" He turned the bay away from the wash, heading up the slope toward the high tableland. The horse picked its way carefully through the slick mud and wet sagebrush, ears flicking back at the rumble of distant thunder. Luke pulled the slicker tighter around Clara, tucking the oilskin under her legs, trying to create a cocoon of warmth. She felt ice cold to the touch, a damp chill that seemed to radiate from her core. The ride to his homestead took 2 hours, a slow, plodding journey through a landscape washed gray by the fading light. Luke kept his eyes on the horizon, navigating by landmarks he knew better than the lines on his own hand. A split rock shaped like a coyote's head, a twist of dead juniper, a dry creek bed that ran parallel to his property line. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like a shipwreck stranded on a sea of grass. It was a small structure of rough-hewn logs, bleached silver by the sun and scoured by the wind. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the corral fence leaning to the south was a collection of mismatched posts and wire that needed mending. A few scrawny cattle, roan and brindle, huddled near the barn, their coats matted with rain. A single, wind-stunted tree grew near the door, leaning at a sharp angle as if trying to run away from the relentless gusts. It was a poor place, a lonely place. Luke felt a flicker of shame as he looked at it through the eyes of a stranger, even one as insensible as the woman in his arms. It was not a place for guests. It was a place for a man who wanted to be left alone. He rode into the yard, the mud sucking at the horse's hooves. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the muck, and carefully pulled Clara down into his arms. She was dead weight now, limp and silent. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of stale wood smoke and dust. Luke kicked the door shut behind him with his heel, shutting out the rising wind. He carried Clara to the narrow bed in the corner, a simple frame strung with rope and topped with a corn husk mattress. He laid her down gently, wincing as her arm flopped lifelessly over the side. He moved quickly then, driven by the urgency of her condition. He struck a match against the stone hearth, the sulfur flare momentary and bright, and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing the stark simplicity of the room. A cast-iron stove, a single table with 2 chairs, a wash basin, and a shelf of tattered books. Luke returned to the bed. He needed to get her warm, and he needed to see how badly she was hurt. He hesitated, his hands hovering over the sodden, ruined dress. Propriety dictated he should not touch her, that he should avert his eyes, but the fabric was soaked through, freezing against her skin, and likely filled with grit that would infect any wounds she had. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the unconscious woman. He worked with efficiency, trying to detach himself from the intimacy of the act. He used his belt knife to cut away the ruined laces of her boots, peeling the wet leather from her swollen feet. He checked her ankles, sprained, likely, judging by the bruising blooming violet under the skin. But the bones felt intact. He unbuttoned the cuffs of her sleeves, peeling the fabric back. Her arms were covered in scrapes and lacerations from the debris in the water, angry red lines against the pale skin. On her wrists, he saw something else, faint, red circles, raw and chafed, rope burns, or ribbon burns, marks of binding. Luke frowned, his thumb brushing lightly over the marred skin. Who ties a woman up? The question burned in his mind, hotter than the lamp. He removed the wet dress only as much as necessary, covering her immediately with his wool blanket. Then a second quilt he pulled from a chest at the foot of the bed. He cut away the fabric around a deep gash on her thigh, washing it with clean water from the pitcher and binding it with strips of clean linen he kept for horse injuries. Throughout it all, he kept his eyes on his work or on her face, never letting his gaze wander. He was a rough man, a man who had seen the worst of humanity during the war and in the chaotic years that followed. But he held to a code. She was helpless under his roof. That made her sacred. He built up the fire in the stove until the iron ticked with heat, filling the small room with warmth. He sat in the chair beside the bed, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the wind howl outside like a searching beast. The night was long and feverish. Clara did not wake, but she did not sleep peacefully. She thrashed beneath the heavy wool blankets, her head turning from side to side on the pillow. "No," she mumbled, her voice high and thin, panic threading through the delirium. "I will be good, I promise. Do not tie me." Luke sat in the chair, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, watching her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Please," Clara whimpered, her hands scrabbling at the blanket. "He is looking at me. I do not like how he looks at me. Do not sell me. Silas, please." The words hit Luke like stones. "Do not sell me." He had thought she was just a traveler, a woman unfortunate enough to be caught in a flash flood. But the marks on her wrists and the terror in her voice told a different story. A story of trade. A story of a woman treated like cattle. Luke looked at her face, flushed now with the heat of returning blood and fever. She looked young, too young to know the kind of fear that made a person beg in their sleep. He thought of the wagon train pressing on, the men shouting to make time, never looking back. They had not just lost her, they had discarded her. He felt a cold, hard anger settle in his gut, familiar and heavy. He knew what it was to be disposable. Toward dawn, the wind died down, leaving a silence that was almost loud. Clara settled into a deeper, quieter sleep. Luke stood up, his joints popping, and moved to the window. The sky was lightening to a bruised gray. The storm had passed, but the world outside looked wet and heavy. He needed to feed the stock. He needed to check the fences. Life did not stop for tragedies. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and bacon grease. For a long moment, she lay still, her eyes closed, listening. The sounds were wrong. The creak of the wagon was gone. The shouting of the drivers was gone. Instead, there was the hiss of something cooking, the crackle of a fire, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on wood. She opened her eyes and panic seized her throat. She was in a room she did not know. Above her were rough-hewn rafters, dark with soot. To her left, a window showed a square of bright, harsh light. She tried to sit up, but her body screamed in protest. Every muscle felt bruised, and a sharp pain radiated from her hip. She gasped, clutching the blanket to her chin. She looked down and realized she was not wearing her dress. She was in her chemise, covered by strange, heavy blankets that smelled of horse and man. "Where?" she whispered. The door opened, and a man stepped inside. Clara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough log wall, ignoring the pain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was him, the man from the water, the cowboy. Luke stopped in the doorway, taking off his hat. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way her pupils dilated, the way she made herself small. He stayed where he was, filling the frame of the door, the morning light silhouetting his broad shoulders. "Easy, miss," he said, his voice low and rumbled, like rocks rolling downhill. "You are safe." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "Who are you? Where's my stepfather? Where is the wagon?" Luke stepped inside and closed the door, moving slowly, telegraphing his movements so as not to startle her. He walked to the stove and poured a cup of coffee from a battered blue pot. "My name is Luke. You are on my ranch, about 10 miles south of where the water took you." He turned and held out the cup, but he did not come closer. He set it on the edge of the table, well within her reach, but far enough that he didn't have to invade her space. "As for the wagon," he said, his voice flattening, losing its softness, "they kept going. The flood separated you. I pulled you out." Clara's mind reeled. Images flashed behind her eyes, the brown wall of water. Silas's face twisted in fear and greed. The shove. "He shoved me. They didn't come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Luke said simply. "I watched until they were out of sight. They didn't turn around." The truth of it hit her harder than the floodwater had. She slumped slightly, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow. She looked down at the blanket, her fingers gripping the wool so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was alone. She was with a stranger, and she had nothing. I am not dressed," she whispered, shame flushing her cheeks. Luke cleared his throat and looked away, directing his gaze to a spot on the floor near his boots. "Your things were ruined, torn apart by the river. I had to bind your leg." He walked over to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, the same one he had taken the quilt from. He knelt and opened it. The hinges groaned, a sound of disuse. He reached inside and pulled out a dress. It was a simple thing, made of calico with a pattern of small yellow flowers, faded with age but clean and carefully folded. He stood and placed it on the chair near the bed, then stepped back quickly. "It belonged to my sister, Ellen. He said she was about your size, maybe a little taller." Clara looked at the dress. It was ghost clothing. "Where is she, your sister?" Luke's face closed down. The shutters on his expression slammed tight. She passed on. 5 years ago. Fever." He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "There's food on the stove, coffee in the pot. The privy is out back, behind the wood pile. I have got work to do in the barn. I will leave you to get decent." He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Clara alone with the smell of bacon and the ghost of a girl named Ellen. The days that followed had a slow, limping rhythm to them. Clara recuperated by inches. Her body was a map of bruises, purple, yellow, and green blooming across her skin. Her hip ached with every step, and her lungs felt raw, as if she had inhaled sandpaper. But she was young, and her body wanted to heal. The shame, however, did not heal as quickly. She was a single woman living in the house of a single man. In the world she had come from, the world of town gossip and church socials and strict rules, this was a catastrophe. It was ruin. But out here, in the vast silence of the territory, the rules felt distant, muffled by the wind. Still, she could not be a burden. That lesson had been beaten into her since childhood. If you do not work, you do not eat. If you are not useful, you are discarded. Silas had taught her that. The flood had proven it. On the third day, despite the stiffness in her legs, Clara pushed herself out of the chair. Luke was outside, mending a section of the corral fence that the wind had knocked loose. She watched him through the window for a moment. He worked methodically, his movements economical and strong. He never looked at the house. He never seemed to check on her. Yet she knew he was aware of her. She found a broom in the corner, the bristles worn down to nubs. She began to sweep the rough plank floor. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight. She swept until her back ached and her forehead was damp with sweat. Then she found a basin and washed the few dishes from breakfast, scrubbing the tin plates until they shone. When Luke came in for the midday meal, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the clean floor. He looked at the stacked dishes. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing by the stove, her hands clasped anxiously in front of her, wearing Ellen's yellow-flowered dress. "You should be resting," he said, removing his gloves. "I can work," Clara said quickly, her voice breathless. "I am strong enough. I do not want to be. I do not want to take without giving back. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend your clothes." Luke looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. He walked to the basin and washed his hands, the water splashing loudly. "You do not owe me anything." "Clara," he said, "you are recovering. That is your job right now." "But I do," she insisted, stepping forward. "You saved my life. You are feeding me. I have no money. I have no dowry anymore. I have nothing to pay you with but my hands." Luke dried his hands on a towel. Turning to face her, he leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "I didn't pull you out of that river for payment," he said quietly, "and I am not keeping a tally of the biscuits you eat." Clara looked down. It confused her. Men always wanted something. Silas wanted her labor and her price. Mr. Branson wanted a wife to breed and clean. What did Luke want? She began to test him, carefully, like a person testing the thickness of ice on a pond. When he came in for supper that evening, she asked, "Do you get lonely out here?" He chewed his stew slowly. "A man gets used to the quiet. Why did you bring me here?" she asked the next day, as she helped him shell peas on the porch. "Why not take me to town right away?" "Horse was tired," he said, not looking up. "Storm was coming. You were half dead. Would have killed you to ride another 10 miles. She watched his hands, large, scarred, with dirt permanently etched into the lines of his skin. They were gentle hands, despite their look. She remembered how he had held her on the horse, firm, but not grasping. "Are you going to take me back?" she asked on the 5th day. Luke paused in the middle of oiling a bridle. He looked up at her. "Back where? To the mud? To the family that left you?" Clara flinched. The anger in his voice was sudden, like a crack of thunder. I have nowhere else," she whispered. "Then you stay here until you do," Luke said, returning to his work. "I am not putting you out." The memories of the flood came at night, or in the quiet moments when her hands were idle. She would hear the roar of the water. She would feel the lurch of the wagon. But the sharpest memory, the one that cut her like a knife, was the look on Silas's face. It hadn't been panic, not just panic. It had been a choice. He had looked at the trunks, and he had looked at her. He had calculated the weight. The trunks held the gold. She held nothing. "He shoved me." The realization was a cold, hard knot in her chest. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. She had been abandoned. The shame of it burned her. Was she worth so little? Was she so easily thrown away? But beneath the shame, a small, hot coal of fury began to glow. She had survived. She had crawled out of the mud. She was still here. She watched Luke, repairing the fence in the line of sight of the window. He moved a post, tamping the dirt down around it. She realized he was working there on purpose. He was staying where she could see him. He was telling her, without words, "I am not leaving. I am right here." The safety of it made her throat tight. The nervousness of it made her heart race. The weather turned a week after she arrived. The Indian summer heat broke, snapping like a dry twig, and a cold front swept down from the north. The sky turned a flat, iron gray, and the wind began to howl around the corners of the cabin, seeking any crack to enter. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted. The cabin, usually drafty, felt like an icebox. Luke brought in armfuls of wood, stacking them by the stove until the pile was waist-high. "Going to be a hard freeze," he said, dusting bark from his sleeves. He built the fire up in the hearth, the flames roaring up the chimney. They ate supper close to the stove, the silence between them filled by the whistling of the wind. Clara shivered. She couldn't help it. The dress was thin, and the shawl she had found in the chest was not enough against this penetrating cold. Her teeth began to chatter, a soft, clicking sound in the quiet room. Luke looked up from his plate. He saw her shaking. He frowned, a line appearing between his brows. "You are freezing," he stated. I am fine," she stammered. "You are not fine." He stood up and walked to the bed. He stripped the heavy wool blanket, the one he had given her that first night, and brought it over. "Move your chair closer to the fire," he commanded gently. Clara dragged her chair until it was almost on the hearthstones. Luke draped the heavy blanket over her shoulders, tucking it in around her like he was wrapping a package. His hands brushed her neck, warm and rough. She held her breath. He stepped back and sat in his own chair on the other side of the fire. He stretched his long legs out, crossing his boots at the ankles. "Best stay close to the heat tonight," he said. "I will keep the fire fed." Hours passed. The storm raged outside, rattling the shutters and banging against the door like an angry ghost. But inside the circle of firelight, it was warm. Clara huddled in the blanket, watching Luke. He had dozed off, his head tilted back against the wood of the chair, his hat resting on his knee. She studied him. She had never really looked at a man this way before. She looked at the line of his jaw, sharp and darkened by a day's growth of beard. She saw a thin, white scar that ran from his ear down into his collar, a souvenir from a war he never spoke of. She looked at his mouth, relaxed now in sleep, the lips not set in their usual grim line. He was a hard man, a lonely man, but he had saved her. He had given her his sister's dress. He had given her his bed while he slept on a pallet on the floor, though tonight he was in the chair. Why? She felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It traveled down, settling low in her belly. A strange, heavy feeling that frightened her. It was a pull, a magnetic draw. Luke shifted, opening his eyes. He caught her staring. Clara did not look away fast enough. Her face flushed. I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For what?" Luke asked, his voice thick with sleep. "For not leaving me behind. For not throwing me away." Luke sat up straighter, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked at the fire, the orange light dancing in his eyes. "Ain't no decent man leaves a living thing to drown. Clara, it is more than that," she said. "You could have taken me to town and left me at the church door. You kept me here. You fed me." Luke looked at her then. The air between them seemed to charge, changing from the lazy warmth of the fire to something electric. "I reckon I did," he said softly. He reached for the coffee pot that was sitting on the hearth to keep warm. He poured a splash into his mug and then, as an afterthought, offered it to her. "Here, warm you up from the inside." Clara reached out from the folds of the blanket. Her hand met his around the warm tin of the cup. Her fingers brushed against his knuckles. It was a small contact, skin against skin, but it felt like a spark jumping from a flint. A jolt went through Clara, sharp and immediate. She saw Luke's eyes widen slightly. He froze. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. They were suspended in the amber light, the storm howling outside, their hands touching on the cup. Clara saw the sudden, raw hunger in his eyes, not the predatory look of Mr. Branson, but a deep, lonely longing that matched her own. Then Luke pulled his hand back as if the cup were red-hot iron. He sat back in his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. He cleared his throat, a harsh, jagged sound. "Drink that," he said, his voice rough. "I need to check the door latch. Wind sounds like it's trying to tear it off." He stood up abruptly and walked to the door, turning his back on her. Clara sat with the cup in her hands, her heart pounding against her ribs, feeling the ghost of his touch on her fingers, hot and terrifying and wonderful. The tension in the room was a pulled bowstring, humming in the silence. The morning broke with a deceptive stillness, the sky a polished dome of hard blue that gave no hint of the storms that had ravaged the land weeks prior. At the corral fence, Luke tightened the cinch on the bay horse, the leather groaning against the animal's ribs. He worked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, but his jaw was set in a line of granite. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands smoothing the skirts of the yellow-flowered dress. It had been washed and pressed with a flat iron heated on the stove, but it was still a borrowed thing, a ghost's clothing on a living woman. She watched Luke work, fear fluttering in her throat like a trapped moth. "It is time," Luke said, not turning around. He let the stirrup fall into place with a heavy clink. "We cannot stay out here hiding forever. Clara, we need to know if anyone is looking for you. We need the doctor to say you are mended." Clara gripped the rough wood of the porch railing. Part of her wanted to stay in the sanctuary of this broken-down cabin until the snows came and buried the world. Here, the only judgment came from the wind and the silence. In town, there were eyes, there were tongues, and somewhere, perhaps, there was Silas Vance. "Do you think they are still there?" she asked, her voice small. Luke turned then, tipping his hat back. The wagon train moved on. "Clara, men like that do not wait, but Branson lives in town, and your stepfather. A man who sells his daughter does not leave without his payment if he can help it." The bluntness of his words stung, but it was a clean pain, like alcohol on a cut. He did not lie to her. Clara walked down the steps, wincing slightly as her hip protested the movement. She was healing, but the deep bruising had settled into a dull, persistent ache that flared when the weather changed or when she moved too quickly. Luke offered his hand to help her mount the spare horse, a steady, roan mare he called Bess. His grip was firm, his fingers calloused and warm. For a second, as she settled into the saddle, she looked down at him. His eyes were shadowed by the brim of his hat, concealing his thoughts, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. He was worried too. They rode out of the valley in silence, leaving the safety of the homestead behind. The ride to Oakhaven was a journey through a graveyard of the storm. They passed ravines that were still choked with drying mud. The high water mark painted brown on the trunks of cottonwoods 10 feet above the current creek level. Driftwood and dead cattle lay tangled in brush, smelling of rot and earth. It was a brutal reminder of the force that had thrown them together. Further on, the landscape changed. They rode through a stretch of black, scorched earth where a lightning strike had set the prairie ablaze 2 summers ago. The charred skeletons of sagebrush stood like blackened bones against the sky, but beneath them, pushing up through the ash and soot, bright green spears of new grass were fighting for the sun. Luke gestured to the blackened ground. "Fire takes everything," he said quietly. "It burns hot and fast, but the land remembers how to grow. It just takes a few seasons." Clara looked at the green shoots. "Is that what we are doing?" she asked. "Growing back?" Luke looked straight ahead, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We are trying," he said. As they crested the final long hill, the town of Oakhaven revealed itself. It sat in a shallow bowl of the plains, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness. A church steeple poked a white finger at the sky, and the dust of the main street hung in the air, kicked up by wagons and riders. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She pulled her shawl closer, though the sun was warm. "Stay close to me," Luke said. "Keep your head up. You have done nothing to be ashamed of." They rode down the main thoroughfare. The town was busy for a weekday. A freight wagon was unloading barrels in front of the livery, and men stood on the boardwalks, smoking and talking. The sound of a piano tinkled faintly from the saloon, tinny and out of tune. As Luke and Clara passed, the talking stopped. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. It started as a ripple and spread like a wave. A woman sweeping her porch paused, leaning on her broom, her gaze raking over Clara's borrowed dress and her unpinned hair. 2 men outside the barber shop stopped their conversation, watching the pair ride by with open, disrespectful curiosity. Clara felt the weight of their stares physically, like stones piling onto her shoulders. She fixed her eyes on the horse's ears, refusing to look left or right, but she could hear the whispers starting. "Is that her?" The one from the flood, riding with him, bold as brass. Luke stared straight ahead, his face a mask of indifference, but Clara saw his left hand drifting closer to his hip, near the heavy revolver he wore. They stopped in front of a small, white-painted house with a sign that read, "Physician and Surgeon." Luke dismounted and tied the horses, then reached up to help Clara down. As her feet touched the dust, her knees buckled slightly. He caught her, his hands steadying her by the elbows. "Steady," he murmured. They went inside. The office smelled of camphor, rubbing alcohol, and old paper. Doctor. Albright was a man of 60 with mutton chop whiskers and spectacles that magnified his kind, tired eyes. He looked up from a ledger as they entered. "Luke," the doctor said, nodding. "I heard you pulled a prize out of the river." Luke did not smile. "This is Miss Clara. She took a beating in the floodwaters 2 weeks back. I want you to look her over. Make sure nothing is broken deep down." The doctor stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come in, child. Sit on the table." Clara sat on the leather-padded examination table, her heart hammering. When the doctor asked her to unbutton the top of her dress so he could listen to her lungs, her fingers trembled so badly she could hardly manage the buttons. Shame flushed her skin hot red. She had been raised to be modest, to be invisible, and now she was being inspected like a piece of a livestock, first by Silas, then by Branson, and now by this stranger. The doctor pressed the cold metal of his stethoscope to her back. "Breathe," he instructed. Clara inhaled, flinching when his hand brushed her shoulder. "Doctor." Albright paused. He pulled back and looked at her, not at her injuries, but at her face. He saw the way she held herself, tight and coiled, waiting for a blow. He looked at Luke, who was standing by the door, hat in hand, watching with hawk-like intensity. "She is healing," Luke said, his voice hard. "I have seen to the cuts." "Doctor." Albright nodded slowly. "The bruises on her ribs are yellowing. That is good. Her lungs sound clear, though there is a roughness that will take time to fade. The water was silty." He turned back to Clara. "You are a lucky young woman. That arroyo has swallowed strong men and never gave them back." He reached for a jar of salve. "This is for the scrapes on your arms. Apply it twice a day. And eat. You are too thin." He wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to Luke. "She is sound." Luke. "Battered, but sound. The fear. Though, that is not something I can stitch up." Luke took the paper, his eyes meeting the doctor's. "I know." They left the office, stepping back out into the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. Clara felt exposed, the doctor's examination having stripped away a layer of her armor. They had not taken 3 steps when a shadow fell across their path. Pastor Green stood on the boardwalk, a tall, gaunt man in a black frock coat that seemed to absorb the light. He held a Bible in one hand, his finger marking a page, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of a sermon. His eyes, pale and watery, fixed on Clara with a look of profound disappointment. "Luke," the pastor said, his voice dry as dust. "And this must be the young woman." Luke nodded once. "Pastor, we have heard stories," Green said, looking down his long nose at Clara. "Stories of a miraculous survival, and stories of irregular arrangements." Clara shrank back, half hiding behind Luke's shoulder. The pastor's gaze lingered on the yellow dress. "That is Ellen's dress, is it not?" Green asked. "It is a strange thing to see the clothes of the dead walking around on a stranger." "She had nothing else," Luke said, his voice dropping an octave. "The river took everything." The pastor pursed his lips. "Charity is a virtue, Luke, but propriety is the fence that keeps the garden of the soul from being trampled. You have had this unmarried woman alone at your ranch for 2 weeks?" "She was injured," Luke said, his jaw tightening until a muscle jumped in his cheek. "She could not ride." "People talk," Green said, stepping closer. "A woman's reputation is like a pane of glass, my dear. Once it is cracked, it can never be made whole again. It does not matter how the crack happened. The glass is ruined all the same. You would have done better to bring her to the church steps, dead or alive, than to keep her in a bachelor's house." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. He was confirming her worst fear, that by surviving, she had destroyed herself. Luke stepped forward, placing himself fully between Clara and the pastor. He towered over the older man. She was drowning. Preacher. The flood did not ask to see a marriage license before it tried to kill her, and I did not ask for the town's permission to save her. If your flock wants to talk, let them talk to me, but do not speak of her ruin when she is the one who fought the water and won. Luke took Clara's elbow. Come on. They walked past the pastor, who stood rigid and affronted, watching them go. We need supplies, Luke said, steering her toward the general store. Do not listen to him. He reads the book, but misses the point. Clara wiped her eyes quickly. He is right, though they all think it. Let them think, Luke growled. They mounted the steps of the general store, the wooden planks thumping under their boots. The store was the heart of the town, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. As they walked in, the conversation inside died instantly. Standing at the counter was Mr. Branson. He looked exactly as Clara remembered him, heavy, sweating slightly in his suit, his face flushed. He was inspecting a bolt of fabric. When he turned and saw her, the color drained from his face, then rushed back in a violent tide of red. Clara, he said, the name coming out as a wheeze. Clara froze. Her hands began to shake. Mr. Branson dropped the fabric. You are alive, Silas said. He said you were gone, swept away. I survived, Clara whispered. Branson's eyes swept over her, taking in the borrowed dress, the bruises on her face, and finally, Luke standing just behind her. The shock in Branson's eyes was replaced by a cold, calculating anger. You have been with him? Branson pointed a thick finger at Luke. Luke stepped forward. I found her in the water. Branson. While you and the wagon train were running for high ground, Branson sneered, his lip curling. We were saving the dowry, saving the goods. We thought she was dead. He looked back at Clara, his gaze shifting from surprise to disgust. He looked at her as if she were a piece of fruit that had fallen on the ground, bruised, dirty, and no longer worth the price he had agreed to pay. 2 weeks, Branson muttered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, alone with a cowboy in a shack. Everyone knows what that means. You expect me to honor the contract now? For damaged goods? The insult hung in the air, heavy and gross. Clara felt sick. Luke's hands curled into fists at his sides. Watch your mouth. Branson! Suddenly, the door to the back office of the store banged open. Silas Vance emerged. He looked haggard, his coat dusty, but his eyes were sharp. When he saw Clara, he stopped dead. For a second, Clara saw genuine fear in his eyes, the fear of a ghost returning to haunt him. But Silas was a survivor, a man who could twist any situation to his advantage. The fear vanished, replaced by a mask of performative outrage. Clara, he shouted. He rushed forward, pushing past a farmer to get to the front of the room. He did not hug her. He stopped 3 feet away, panting, his eyes darting around the room to gauge the audience. My poor girl, he proclaimed, his voice shaking with false emotion. I searched for 3 days. I called your name until my voice failed me. I thought the river had taken you to God. Clara stared at him, stunned by the magnitude of the lie. You never came back, she stammered. I watched the wagons leave. Silas waved his hand dismissively. You were confused, shock. The water was wild. I risked my life trying to find you, but the mud was too deep. He turned on Luke, his finger stabbing the air. And you found her? Why did you not bring her to me? Why did you keep her hidden? I brought her here as soon as she could ride, Luke said, his voice deadly calm. And I saw your wagon train. Vance, you didn't stop. You whipped those horses until you were clear. You left her to die. Liar, Silas screamed, playing to the crowd. He turned to the townspeople, who were gathering on the porch and crowding the doorway. He is a predator. He stole my daughter and kept her for his own pleasure. He took advantage of a helpless girl, and now he tries to slander a grieving father. The crowd murmured. They looked at Luke, the loner, the man with the scar, the man who didn't come to church. Then they looked at Silas, a man in a suit, a man who spoke with passion. The dynamic shifted. The truth didn't matter. The story mattered. And Silas was telling a better story. "That is not true," Clara cried out. Her voice was thin, trembling, but she forced it from her throat. "He saved me. You pushed me. Silas!" "You pushed me out of the wagon." Silas moved faster than a striking snake. He lunged forward and grabbed Clara's arm, his fingers digging into the tender flesh where the bruises were just fading. He gave her a sharp shake. "Hush now," Silas hissed, though he made it sound like comfort. "You are delirious, child. The trauma has turned your mind. You do not know what you are saying." He looked at Branson. "She is confused. She needs her family. We will take her back. We will fix this." Branson looked at Clara, then at the crowd. He saw his reputation wavering. "I will not take a soiled woman. Vance, the deal is off, but perhaps she can work off the debt in the store." In the back, the implication was clear. She was no longer a wife-to-be. She was a servant. Or worse. Luke moved. He stepped in, breaking the distance in a single stride. He brought his hand down on Silas's wrist, the one gripping Clara, and squeezed. It was a grip of iron. Silas yelped, his fingers springing open. He stumbled back, clutching his wrist. "Do not touch her," Luke said. The words were not shouted. They were whispered, but they carried across the room like the cocking of a hammer. He looked at Branson. "And you, if you speak of her as anything other than a lady, I will come back here, and we will settle it." Luke turned to Clara. She was shaking violently, her face pale as ash. "We are leaving," he said. Silas scrambled back, putting the store counter between him and Luke. "You cannot take her. She is my ward. That is kidnapping. She is of age," Luke said, "and she is free to go where she pleases." He looked at Clara. "Clara?" Clara looked at Silas, rubbing his wrist and glaring with hate. She looked at Branson, who looked at her with cold contempt. She looked at the townspeople, their faces closed and judging. Then she looked at Luke. He was the only solid thing in the spinning room. "I am going with him," she whispered. She turned and walked out the door, her head down, passing through the gauntlet of stairs. Luke followed, walking backward for the first few steps, keeping his eyes on Silas and Branson until he was across the threshold. They mounted their horses in a heavy, suffocating silence. No one tried to stop them, but the air was thick with unsaid threats. As they rode out of town, the whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. The ride back to the ranch was a funeral march. The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of red and gold, turning the clouds into bruised welts. The wind picked up, sharp and cool, cutting through their clothes. Clara rode with her eyes fixed on the mane of her horse. She felt dirty. The pastor's words echoed in her mind. Like a pane of glass, they had looked at her and seen a sin. They had listened to Silas's lies and nodded. Luke rode beside her, his silhouette dark against the burning sky. He did not speak. He seemed to be carrying a weight of his own, his shoulders hunched, his hat pulled low. When they finally reached the cabin, the light was gone. The stars were coming out, cold and distant. They tended to the horses in silence, the only sounds the stamp of hooves and the rustle of hay. Inside, Luke lit the lamp. The golden glow pushed back the shadows, making the small room feel like a fortress against the world. Clara sat at the table, still wearing her shawl. She didn't take it off. She felt she needed the protection. Luke put a kettle on the stove. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, looking at her. "I'm sorry," he said. I thought the truth would matter to them." Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. It sounded jagged in the quiet room. The truth never mattered. Luke. Not to men like them. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the dam broke. The tears didn't come, but the words did. They poured out of her, hot and fast. "I never wanted to marry him. Silas, He owed money, gambling debts, bad investments. He looked at me across the dinner table one night and he didn't see a daughter. He saw a banknote. He traded me. Luke, he haggled over me like I was a horse at an auction. She is obedient, he said. She is quiet. She stood up, pacing the small floor, her hands twisting in the fabric of the dress. He taught me that silence was my only value. If I spoke, I was trouble. If I cried, I was weak. So I let him put me in that wagon. I let him tie the ribbon on my wrists so I wouldn't run. And when the water came, she stopped, turning to face Luke, her eyes shining with unshed tears. When the water came, he looked at me, and I saw it in his face. He thought, if she dies, I can keep the dowry and I don't have to hand it over. He wanted me to die. Luke, it wasn't just panic. It was a wish. Luke watched her, his expression softening. The hardness around his eyes melted away, leaving only a deep, profound sorrow. He walked over to the table and pulled out a chair. Sit, Clara. She sat. He sat opposite her, close enough that their knees almost touched. I know what it is like, he said quietly, to be painted as the villain when you tried to do right. He looked down at his hands, tracing the scar on his thumb. 5 years ago, before Ellen died, there was a range war here. Big cattle barons against the small homesteaders. They were cutting fences, burning barns. I tried to stay out of it. But one night, I saw a group of men corner a boy, a homesteader's son, no older than 16. They were going to hang him for cutting wire. Luke looked up, his eyes dark with the memory. I stepped in. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to talk them down. But someone fired a gun. The boy got hit in the crossfire. He died in my arms. Clara gasped softly. The town, Luke continued, his voice devoid of emotion, blamed me. They said if I hadn't interfered, the boy would have just been whipped and sent home. They said I brought the violence. The barons used their money to buy the judge, and the homesteaders needed someone to blame for their grief. So I became the pariah, the man with blood on his hands. He looked at Clara, his gaze intense and steady. Pastor Green looks at me and sees a killer, just like he looks at you and sees a sinner. They decide who we are because it is easier than looking at their own darkness. Clara reached across the table. She didn't think about it. She just did it. She covered his scarred hand with her own. You tried to save him, she whispered. Just like you saved me. I failed him, Luke said. But you didn't fail me. They sat there in the lamplight, two outcasts in a wooden cabin on the edge of the world. The town had rejected them. The law had failed them. The church had condemned them. But in that shared confession, in the space between their hands, something new was building. It was stronger than the walls of the cabin. It was trust. I am not going back, Clara said, her voice steady for the first time that day. I will not let them sell me again. Luke turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. No, he said, you are staying here, and if they come for you, let them come. We will be ready. The wind howled outside, rattling the door. But inside, the air was still and warm. Clara looked at their joined hands and felt the first true stirring of hope she had known in years. She was not alone, and for the first time in her life, she was not for sale. The news came not like a flood, but like the dry, choking dust that was slowly swallowing the ranch. It arrived on the lips of Jeb Miller, a drifting ranch hand who rode fence for the sprawling Bar T outfit to the north. He stopped by Luke's place ostensibly to water his horse, but his eyes were full of a dark, eager knowing. Luke stood by the pump, his shirt stained with sweat, working the handle to fill the trough. The water trickled out thin and muddy. The aquifer was dropping. The sky above was a relentless, pale expanse of white heat, bleaching the color out of the world. Jeb leaned over his saddle horn, rolling a cigarette with one hand. They are talking in town. Luke, he said, licking the paper. Luke did not look up. Men always talk. Jeb, usually when they have nothing better to do. This is different, Jeb said, striking a match on his boot heel. Branson is telling anyone who will listen that the girl chose to run off. Says she seduced you into taking her in. Says a woman of virtue would have walked 10 miles back to the wagons rather than spend a night under a bachelor's roof. Luke stopped pumping. The iron handle creaked into silence. He looked at Jeb, his eyes narrowing against the glare. He says I abducted her? Luke asked, his voice low. Jeb shrugged, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. Not in so many words. Yet, mostly he is saying she is ruined, damaged goods. Says you two are living in sin and flouting the laws of God and man. The women in town, well, you know how they are. They say no decent man would shelter a stray filly without expecting a ride. Luke dropped the bucket he was holding. It hit the dry earth with a dull thud. Get off my land. Jeb held up his hands in mock surrender. Just telling you the wind. Luke, do not shoot the weather vane. He turned his horse and trotted off, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the stagnant air for 20 minutes. Luke stood there, watching him go. His hands clenched so tight the knuckles were white ridges. He felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, an old, jagged anger that he thought he had buried years ago. It was the same anger he had felt when the boy died in his arms, the fury of seeing the truth twisted into a noose by men with money and soft hands. He turned toward the house. Clara was standing in the doorway, holding a basket of dried beans she had been sorting. Her face was pale. She had heard. Clara set the basket down on the porch railing, her movement stiff. She looked out at the shimmering horizon, refusing to meet his eyes. They are saying I am a whore, aren't they? She asked. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Luke walked up the steps, wiping his hands on a rag. They are saying what small minds always say. Clara, it means nothing. It means everything, Clara snapped, turning to him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. It means I have dragged you down with me. You had a life here, Luke. It was lonely, maybe, but it was respectable. Now you are the man who keeps a fallen woman. I am a curse. Every time a man tries to help me, he gets punished for it. Luke tossed the rag onto the bench. Stop that. You are not a curse. You are a victim of a bad man and a bad river. And now I am the cause of your ruin, she whispered, her voice cracking. I should have kept walking that first night. I should have let the cold take me. Do not say that, Luke growled, stepping closer. Do not ever say that. He wanted to reach out and shake her, to tell her that her life was worth more than the whispers of 1,000 hypocrites in Oakhaven. But he held back. The space between them was charged, dangerous. To cross it would prove the gossips right. So he stood there, helpless in his anger, watching the shame eat at her. The land seemed to conspire with the town to squeeze them dry. The rain that had caused the flood was a distant memory. In its place, a drought settled over the plains with the weight of a heavy wool blanket. The ground turned to powder. Every step kicked up a puff of alkali dust that tasted of chalk and bitterness. It coated the windowsills, settled in the creases of their clothes, and grit between their teeth when they ate. The creek, which had been a rushing torrent just weeks ago, was now a sluggish, muddy ribbon winding through cracked mud flats. The cattle grew lethargic, their ribs showing through their dusty hides as they searched for grass that had turned brittle and brown. The strain of keeping the ranch alive fraying their nerves. Luke worked from before dawn until long after dark, moving the herd from one meager pasture to another, digging out the spring to keep the water flowing. He came in at night exhausted, his face masked in dirt, his temper short. Clara worked just as hard. She took over the garden, hauling buckets of gray water to keep the few vegetables alive. She scrubbed the floors, mended fence where she could, and cooked meals from their dwindling supplies. But the silence in the cabin grew heavy. It was a silence filled with things they could not say. One evening, the heat lingered long after sunset, oppressive and thick. They sat at the table, picking at a supper of cornbread and beans. The only sound was the clicking of forks and the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. We are running low on flour, Clara said quietly. Luke did not look up. We have enough for 2 weeks. We should go to town, she suggested. No, Luke said, the words snapping like a dry twig. "We are not going back there yet, not until this talk dies down. It will not die down." "Luke!" Clara slammed her fork down. "Silence only feeds it. If we hide out here, we are admitting guilt. We should go in there. You should confront Branson, make him tell the truth. And do what?" Luke shot back, his eyes flashing. "Start a fist fight in the general store? That is exactly what he wants. He wants me to lose my temper so he can have the sheriff lock me up. Then where would you be?" "I can take care of myself," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Like you did in the wagon?" Luke asked. It was a cruel thing to say. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. He saw Clara flinch as if he had slapped her. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean that. The heat, it is making me crazy." Clara stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "No, you meant it. You see me as a helpless thing you have to guard, a burden. I see you as someone I am trying to keep alive," Luke shouted, standing up to face her. "Why can you not understand that? I'm trying to protect you from a town that wants to tear you apart. Maybe I do not want your protection if it costs you your name." Clara yelled back. "Maybe I should just leave and let you have your peace back." She turned and ran into the small partitioned area where her bed was, pulling the curtains shut with a violent swish. Luke stood in the main room, his chest heaving, listening to the sound of her stifled sobs through the thin fabric. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He grabbed his hat and stormed out of the cabin, needing the dark, needing the air, needing anything but the sound of her crying. The night was vast and indifferent. The stars were hard, cold points of light that offered no comfort. Luke sat on the top rail of the corral fence, smoking a cigarette he didn't really want, watching the sleeping cattle. He was terrified. He wouldn't admit it to her, and he barely admitted it to himself. But the fear was there, a cold stone in his gut. He wasn't afraid of Branson. He wasn't afraid of the pastor. He was afraid of the way the cabin felt empty when she was outside. He was afraid of the way his eyes sought her out whenever he came into the yard. He was afraid that he wanted her. And he knew, with the cynical certainty of a man who had seen the world at its worst, that wanting something was the surest way to lose it. The town would destroy them if he made a move. They were waiting for it. One slip, one moment of weakness, and they would descend like vultures. He threw the cigarette into the dirt and ground it out with his heel. He needed to check the horses. It was 3 hours past midnight when Clara moved. She had waited until she heard Luke's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep from his pallet on the floor. She rose silently, moving like a ghost in the dark room. She did not light a lamp. She packed her bundle quickly. The yellow dress, a loaf of bread, a canteen of water. She put on her boots, wincing as the leather creaked. She wrote no note. Words would only make it harder. She crept to the door, lifted the latch with agonizing slowness, and slipped out into the night. The air was cool, a relief after the heat of the day. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to see the outline of the barn. Clara walked quickly, her heart pounding in her ears. She would take Bess. She would ride north, away from Oakhaven, away from the gossip. She would find a job in a different territory. She would disappear. It was the only way to fix what she had broken. Luke would be angry, yes, but eventually he would be relieved. He would have his life back. She slid open the barn door. The smell of hay and horse sweat enveloped her, warm and earthy. The horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly. Clara grabbed a bridle from the hook. Her hands were shaking. She moved toward Bess's stall. "Going somewhere?" The voice came from the shadows near the tack room. It was deep, calm, and terrifying. Clara gasped, dropping the bridle. It clattered loudly on the hard-packed dirt floor. Luke stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't sleeping. He was fully dressed, leaning against a support post, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a part of the barn, hewn from the same rough timber. I have to go." "Luke," Clara stammered, backing away until she hit the stall door. He didn't move toward her. He just watched her, his eyes catching the faint starlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. "In the middle of the night? With no money and a stolen horse?" he asked. "I wasn't stealing her," Clara said defensively. "I would have sent her back. Or left her for you to find." Luke shook his head slowly. "You wouldn't make it 10 miles. The country north of here is dry. There are no wells for 3 days' ride. You would die." "Clara, is that what you want? To finish what the flood started?" "I want to stop hurting you," she cried, the tears finally spilling over. "I am ruining you. Luke, do you think I do not see the way you look when you come back from checking the lines? You are tired. You are angry. You are carrying the weight of the whole world because of me." Luke pushed off the post. He walked toward her, slow and steady. "You think you know what I am carrying?" he asked, his voice rising. "You think it is the town? You think I care about what a man like Branson thinks of me?" "Then what is it?" Clara shouted, throwing her hands up. "Why are you so angry? Why do you look at me like you wish I was not here?" "Because I am terrified," Luke roared. The sound of his voice filled the barn, silencing the rustling horses. Clara froze, her mouth open. Luke stopped 3 feet from her. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. He raked a hand through his hair, knocking his hat back. "I am terrified. Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Not of them, of this, of you." Clara stared at him, confused. "Of me, of losing you," he said. He took another step, closing the distance until he was standing right in front of her. The smell of him, wood smoke, tobacco, and rain, filled her senses. "I look at you, and I see the only thing in this God-forsaken country that is real," Luke said, the words tumbling out now, raw and unguarded. "I wake up in the middle of the night checking to make sure you are still breathing. I work myself to the bone so I do not have to think about how much I want to sit in that chair and just watch you read by the fire." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "And I'm angry because I know that if I reach for you, if I take what I want, the town will turn it into something dirty. They will say I took advantage. They will say I claimed my payment. I am scared that if I touch you, I will prove them right." Clara looked up at him. The moonlight illuminated the sharp planes of his face, the scar on his jaw, the deep, dark wells of his eyes. She saw the fear there, but she also saw the hunger. It mirrored the hollow ache that had been growing in her own chest for weeks. "You could never be like them?" she whispered. She saw his throat work as he swallowed. He didn't move. He stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, restraining himself with a physical effort she could almost feel. "You are free to go." "Clara," he said, his voice straining, "if you want to leave, I will saddle the horse for you. I will give you money. I will let you go. But do not tell me you are doing it for me." Clara looked at the door. The night was out there, freedom, of a sort. Then she looked at Luke. He was offering her an out. He was giving her the choice that Silas never gave her, that Branson never gave her. He was letting her decide her own worth. "I do not want to go," she said softly. The air in the barn seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and electric. The dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight seemed to freeze. Luke looked at her, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "Then why are you packing a bag? Because I didn't think you wanted me to stay." "Not really." Luke let out a long, ragged breath. "God help me. Clara, I have never wanted anything more." He didn't move. He waited. He gave her the room, the space, the power. Clara took a step forward, then another. She stopped when she was inches from him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and placed her palm on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, a frantic, heavy rhythm against her fingertips. "Luke," she breathed. She leaned in. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grab her. He waited until her lips were a breath away from his. He waited until she closed the gap. When their lips met, it wasn't like the stories in the Penny Dreadfuls. It wasn't soft and sweet. It was desperate. It was the collision of two people who had been starving for a lifetime. Luke groaned, a low sound in his throat. His resolve shattered. His hands came up, not to grab, but to hold. He cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, his fingers tangling in her hair. His other hand settled on her waist, pulling her flush against him. Clara gasped into the kiss, her hands clutching his shoulders, pulling him closer. He tasted of coffee and longing. His beard scratched her chin, rough and real. She felt small in his arms, but not weak. She felt anchored. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without words. It was an admission of all the fear, all the loneliness, all the nights spent listening to the wind and wishing for this. Luke kissed her with a restraint that bordered on pain, careful not to crush her, careful to let her lead, even as his own desire threatened to consume him. They broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. Luke's hands were shaking as they rested on her waist. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, as if trying to memorize the feeling. "Clara," he whispered, his voice wrecked. Clara opened her eyes. The barn looked the same, the hay, the stalls, the hanging tack. But the world had shifted on its axis. She felt exposed, her skin tingling, her heart racing. But she also felt alive, truly, vividly alive. "I choose this," she said, her voice fierce. "Do you hear me? Luke, I choose this. Not because I have nowhere to go, not because you saved me, because I want you." Luke opened his eyes. They were dark and intense. "If we do this, if we are together, the town will not let it stand. They will come for us." "Let them come," Clara said, echoing his words from weeks ago. Luke pulled back slightly, looking at her with a seriousness that sobered the moment. "We cannot give them ammunition. Clara, not yet. We have to be smart. We cannot rush this. If they see us, like this, before we clear your name, they will hang me and brand you." Clara nodded, understanding the danger. "I know." Luke brought his hand up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was incredibly gentle. "But I am done pretending I do not care," he said. "I am done sleeping on the floor thinking about you in that bed." "We will face it," Clara said. "Together. Together." Luke agreed. He stepped back, the loss of contact hitting them both like a physical chill. He picked up the bridle she had dropped and hung it back on the hook. "Go back to the house. Clara, unpack your bag. I will finish checking the horses." Clara nodded. She picked up her bundle. She walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Luke was watching her, his figure stark in the shadows. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes was enough to keep her warm for 100 winters. The truce with the world lasted 3 days. They fell into a new rhythm. It was a careful, tentative dance. They didn't touch often. The danger was too high, the temptation too great, but the air between them was no longer heavy with silence. It was light with promise. They talked. They sat closer by the fire. When Luke rode out in the morning, Clara watched him go with a smile, and he always turned to tip his hat before cresting the ridge. But the world outside the fence line was not idle. On the 4th day, just after the noon meal, the dogs began to bark. Luke went to the window, his rifle in hand. A buggy was coming up the track, followed by a rider on horseback. The dust billowed behind them. "It is Pastor Green," Luke said, his voice tightening. "And Deputy Hayes?" Clara froze, the dish towel in her hand. Why would the deputy come? Luke didn't answer. He leaned the rifle against the wall. He wouldn't greet them with a weapon. That would look guilty, and opened the door. "Stay inside." "Clara, no," she said, putting the towel down. "We said together—" Luke looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the steel. He nodded once, together. They walked out onto the porch as the buggy pulled up. The black paint of the carriage was coated in gray dust. Pastor Green sat on the bench, looking grim and pious. Deputy Hayes, a young man with a nervous twitch and a tin star pinned to his vest, rode beside him. "Luke," the deputy said, nodding. "Hayes," Luke replied. "Preacher, to what do I owe the visit?" Pastor Green climbed down from the buggy. He dusted off his coat with sharp, angry movements. "We are not here for a social call. Luke, we are here on official business. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to the deputy, who looked at it uncomfortably before handing it to Luke. "What is this?" Luke asked, not looking at it. "It is a summons," Hayes mumbled. "Mr. Branson. Well, he has filed a formal complaint with the circuit judge." Luke unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the legal scrawl. His face turned to stone. "Abduction," Luke read aloud, his voice flat. "And damages," Green added. Stepping forward, "Mr. Branson claims that you unlawfully detained his betrothed, thereby violating his contract with Mr. Vance. He claims you have damaged his investment." Clara gasped. "Investment?" She stepped forward to the railing. "I am a person, not a crate of goods." Pastor Green looked at her with cold pity. "In the eyes of the law, my dear, until you are married, you are the ward of your stepfather, and he had a contract. By keeping you here, Luke has essentially stolen property." "That is a lie," Clara shouted. "I stayed of my own free will." The deputy shifted in his saddle. "That is for the judge to decide. Ma'am, the hearing is set for Friday, in Oak Haven." "And if I do not come?" Luke asked, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Then I will have to come back with the sheriff and a warrant for your arrest," Hayes said apologetically. "Do not make me do that. Luke, just come tell your side." Pastor Green smiled, a thin, triumphant expression. "It is time for this charade to end. The town deserves the truth, and Mr. Branson deserves justice." "Get off my land," Luke said. It was not a request. It was a command, delivered with such quiet ferocity that the deputy's horse stepped back. "We will see you Friday," Green said. He climbed back into the buggy. They turned and rode away, the wheels crunching on the dry earth. Luke and Clara stood on the porch, watching the dust settle. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of the barn. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Clara was trembling. Her hands gripped the railing so hard a splinter dug into her palm. "Damaged investment," she whispered. "That is what he called me." Luke turned to her. He took her hands, prying them off the wood. "Clara, look at me." She looked up. Her eyes were wide with terror. The land around them, baked hard, cracked, unforgiving, seemed to be closing in. There was nowhere to run. "They are going to take me back," she said. "The judge will listen to them. They have money. They have the law." Luke's jaw was set so hard she thought his teeth might shatter. "No," he said, "they have a story. But we have the truth, and I am done playing by their rules." He looked out at the horizon, his mind racing. He was already planning. He was counting the favors he was owed. He was thinking of the few men in the territory who hadn't been bought by the cattle barons or the merchants. "We are going to fight them. Clara, not with fists. With the one thing they don't think we have." "What is that?" Clara asked. "Witnesses," Luke said. He turned back to the door. "Pack your things. Clara, we have a ride to make. We are going to find the cowboys who saw the wagon train that day. We are going to find the doctor. We are going to drag every ugly truth about Silas Vance into the light of day." "But what if we lose?" Clara asked, her voice small. Luke stopped. He looked at her, and the fire in his eyes burned hot enough to scorch the earth. "Then we run," he said. "But we make them look us in the eye first." He walked into the house to get his gun belt. Clara stood on the porch for a moment longer, looking at the heat waves rising from the ground. She was terrified. But as she thought of Luke's kiss in the barn, and the way he had stood up to the deputy, she felt the steel in her own spine straighten. She was not an investment. She was Clara, and she was ready for war. The dawn arrived not with the promise of light, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of a lead blanket. The sky was a bruised expanse of charcoal and slate, the clouds hanging so low they seemed to scrape the tops of the cottonwoods. The air was thick with humidity, charged with the static of an approaching storm that threatened to be as violent as the one that had birthed this trouble weeks ago. Clara stood on the porch, smoothing the fabric of the yellow-flowered dress. Her hands were trembling, a subtle vibration that traveled all the way up her arms to her neck. She clasped them together, squeezing until the knuckles turned white, trying to force the fear back down into the pit of her stomach. Luke walked out of the barn leading Bess and his bay. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a clean white shirt that was tight across his broad shoulders, a black vest, and a string tie. He had polished his boots, though the dust of the yard was already settling on the leather. He looked less like a cowboy, and more like a man facing a firing squad with his eyes open. He tied the horses to the rail and walked up the steps. He stopped in front of Clara, his shadow falling over her. "Are you ready?" he asked. His voice was low, devoid of the anger that had fueled him for days. Now, there was only a grim determination. Clara looked at the dark horizon. "I feel like I am going to my execution. Luke." Luke reached out and took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up. "You are going to tell the truth, Clara. That is not an execution. That is a reckoning." He let go and offered her his arm. She took it, feeling the hard muscle beneath the cloth. It was the only steady thing in a world that felt like it was tilting on its axis. The ride into Oak Haven was a gauntlet. The town was awake, unnaturally so for the hour. As they rode down the main street, the silence was absolute. People stood on their porches, coffee cups suspended halfway to their mouths. Men paused in their work at the livery. Women peeked from behind lace curtains. Eyes, hundreds of them. They felt like physical touches, sliding over Clara's skin. Judging, weighing, condemning. She kept her back straight, staring between her horse's ears, but she could hear the whispers trailing in their wake like the hiss of dry leaves. There she is, the fallen one, bold as brass, riding with him. They dismounted in front of the town hall, a large wooden structure that served as a meeting place, dance hall, and courtroom. A crowd had already gathered, spilling out onto the boardwalk. As Luke and Clara approached, the sea of bodies parted. Not out of respect, but out of a desire to avoid contamination. Luke kept a hand on the small of Clara's back, guiding her through the throng. "Do not look down," he murmured. They entered the hall. It was a cramped, airless space that already smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. The windows were closed against the threatening rain, sealing in the heat. At the front of the room, a large table had been set up on a raised platform for the judge. To the left sat Mr. Branson, looking bloated and self-righteous in a gray suit, fanning himself with a folded newspaper. Beside him sat Silas Vance, Clara's stepfather. When Silas saw her, his face twisted into a mask of tragic sorrow so convincing that Clara almost stumbled. He looked older, frailer, a grieving father wronged by the world. It was a performance, she knew, but it chilled her to the bone. Pastor Green sat in the front row, his Bible on his knees. He looked pale, his eyes darting between Branson and Luke, his expression pained, as if he were swallowing something bitter. Luke guided Clara to a bench on the right side of the room. They sat down, isolated. The rest of the town filled the benches behind them and packed into the standing room at the back. The air was heavy, pressing against Clara's chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. "All rise," the bailiff shouted. The side door opened, and Judge Calloway entered. He was an old rancher, a man with skin like cured leather and a white mustache that drooped over his mouth. He walked with a limp, the legacy of a horse wreck 20 years prior. He was not a man of books and statutes. He was a man of the territory, known for a brand of justice that was rough, quick, and usually fair. He sat heavily in the chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked out over the room, his eyes sharp and cynical. This is a hearing to determine the validity of a complaint filed by Mr. Jedediah Branson against Mr. Luke Miller regarding the custody and contract of Miss Clara Vance. The judge rumbled. "It is hot in here. Let us keep this short. Mr. Branson, state your piece." Branson stood up. He smoothed his vest, projecting an air of injured dignity. "Your Honor," he began, his voice booming for the benefit of the crowd, "I am a businessman. I believe in contracts. I believe in a man's word. 2 months ago, I entered into a legal agreement with Mr. Vance here. I paid $100 in gold, a significant sum, to secure the hand of his stepdaughter in marriage. He gestured toward Clara without looking at her, as if she were a piece of furniture in the corner. It was an investment, Your Honor, an investment in my future, in my home. I paid for a wife of good character. I paid for a dowry that included linens and silver. When the wagon train was struck by that flood, I lost the dowry. That was an act of God, and I accept the loss of the goods." He paused, letting the silence hang. "But the girl did not die. She was found. By him." He pointed a thick finger at Luke. "Mr. Miller found my betrothed. And instead of returning her to her lawful guardian, instead of bringing her to the church or the authorities, he kept her for 2 weeks in a one-room cabin, miles from civilization." The crowd murmured. Branson nodded. "Feeding off their energy, he stole what was mine. Judge, and he damaged it. No decent man would shelter a woman alone without taking his payment. I have been robbed of my money, and I have been robbed of the respectable wife I paid for. I demand she be returned to her father so that we may salvage what we can of this arrangement. And I demand, Mr. Miller, pay damages for the stain he has put on my reputation." He sat down, looking smug. The crowd buzzed. It was a compelling story. It spoke to the men's fear of losing property and the women's fear of scandal. Silas Vance was called next. He stood up slowly, leaning on the table as if he were too weak to support himself. "Your Honor," Silas said, his voice trembling, "I am a broken man. That day, that terrible day in the arroyo, it haunts my nightmares." He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. When the water came, it was chaos. I tried to grab Clara's hand. I screamed for her, but she fell. The water took her. I searched. Judge, I searched until my boots were filled with blood. I called her name until I had no voice left. I thought she was dead. I mourned her as if she were my own flesh and blood. He turned to look at Luke, his eyes hardening into venomous slits. To find out she was alive, it was a miracle. But then to hear that this man, this predator, had kept her, that he had hidden her away. Silas slammed his hand on the table. A sudden burst of theatrical rage. He took advantage of a confused, traumatized girl. He has compromised her honor. I want my daughter back. Judge, I want to take her home and pray that we can scrub the sin from her soul." Silas sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. A few women in the back row sniffed loudly, dabbing at their eyes. Clara felt sick. The lies were so smooth, so polished. She looked at Luke. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked dangerous. "Mr. Miller," the judge said, "your turn." Luke stood up. He did not posture. He did not play to the crowd. He stood like a fence post, rooted and unbending. "I was riding the ridge," Luke said, his voice clear and steady. "I saw the clouds. I saw the water coming, and I saw the wagons in the wash." He turned slightly to look at the jury of faces in the room. "I saw the flood hit, and I saw the wagons drive on. They were scrambling up the bank. I saw a girl fall out of the back of the second wagon, and I saw the driver whip the horses and keep going." The room went quiet. Silas's head snapped up, his eyes wide. There was no searching. Luke continued. "There was no calling her name. They ran. They left her in the water." He looked at the judge. "I rode down. I pulled her out. She was half drowned. She was battered. She was clinging to a deadfall branch. And when I grabbed her arm, she fought me because she was terrified. She was clinging to my shirt like she thought I was going to throw her back in." Luke's voice cracked. "Just a fracture, but it was there. She thought she had been thrown away like trash. Your Honor, because that is what they did. They threw her away to save the trunks with the silver." He took a breath, centering himself. "I took her to my cabin because it was the closest shelter and a storm was coming. She was injured. She could not walk. She could barely speak. I gave her my bed. I slept in a chair. I tended her wounds because there was no one else to do it. I didn't bring her to town because she was terrified of the men who left her to die. I didn't steal her. Branson, I saved her life. He sat down. The silence in the room was different now. It was uneasy. The confidence of Branson's narrative had been chipped. The judge leaned forward. "You say they didn't stop? They didn't stop," Luke repeated. "I have a witness." Luke's lawyer, a young man he had hired with the last of his savings, stood up. "Call Thomas Redfield." The door opened and a cowboy walked in. It was the man with the scarred nose from the first day, the one who had worn the wagons. He walked to the front, spinning his hat in his hands. "State your name and what you saw." The judge said, "Tom Redfield." The cowboy said, "I was pushing strays on the North Rim that day. I saw the flood. I saw the wagons. They were moving fast. Judge, real fast. I saw them top the rise and keep going. I watched them for a good 5 miles. They never turned back. Not once." A murmur went through the crowd. This was a neutral party, a working man, doctor. Albright was called next. He adjusted his spectacles and spoke quietly. "I examined Miss Clara 2 days ago." He said, "She had extensive bruising consistent with being battered by debris in a flood, but I also noted older marks, healed fractures in her fingers, scars on her back that did not come from water." He looked at Silas Vance, and I noted that she was terrified. Not of the water, but of being found. The room was shifting. The simple narrative of the grieving father was unraveling. But Branson's lawyer, a slick man from the city, was not done. He called Clara. Clara stood up. Her legs felt like water. She walked to the front of the room and sat in the witness chair. The wood was hard against her spine. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the judgment, the curiosity, the hunger for scandal. Then she saw Luke. He was watching her. He nodded, a microscopic movement. "Reckoning." "Miss Vance," the lawyer said, pacing in front of her. "You claim you were abandoned, but isn't it true that you were unhappy with the arrangement to marry Mr. Branson?" I didn't want to marry him," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Speak up," the judge barked, though not unkindly. "I didn't want to marry him," Clara said louder. "So you had a motive to run away?" The lawyer pressed. "You saw the chaos of the flood as an opportunity to escape your duty?" "No," Clara said. "I fell. Did you fall, or did you jump?" "I was pushed." The words tore out of her. The memory flashed. The wet wood, the tilting wagon, the hand on her shoulder. Silas Vance stood up. "She is lying. She is hysterical. Sit down," the judge roared. "Continue. Miss Clara." Clara looked at Silas. She looked right into his eyes. He looked at the trunks. She said, her voice shaking but gaining strength, "The wagon was slipping. The oxen couldn't pull the weight." He looked at the trunks with the dowry, and he looked at me. And he chose the money. He shoved me. "Judge." He put his hand on my shoulder and he pushed me into the water. A gasp went through the room. It was a horrified sound. "He whipped the horses and he screamed at me to swim," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "He didn't search. He ran." The lawyer tried to regain control. "An outrageous accusation. But let us talk about your time with Mr. Miller. You spent 14 nights in his house. Are we to believe that a man like that, a man with needs, slept in a chair?" "He did," Clara said softly. "And you developed feelings for him?" The lawyer sneered. "You kissed him?" Clara's cheeks burned. The heat in the room seemed to spike. She could lie. She could deny it to save her reputation. But she looked at Luke. He wasn't looking away. He was proud of her. "Yes," she said. The crowd erupted. The scandal was confirmed. "Yes, I kissed him," Clara shouted over the noise, "because he was the first man who ever treated me like a human being. He didn't ask for a contract. He didn't ask for a dowry. He saved me when my own family threw me away. He slept in a chair to protect my honor, while you—" She pointed at Branson. "You talk about me like I am a crate of damaged goods." She was standing now, trembling with fury. "I am not an investment. I am a woman, and I would rather freeze on the prairie than be sold to you." Thunder cracked outside. A sound like a cannon shot right over the roof. The windows rattled in their frames. Then the rain came. It hammered against the shingles, a deafening roar that drowned out the murmurs of the crowd. The lawyer smirked. "She admits to the affection. Judge, she admits to the liaison." She is a tainted woman who ran off with her lover. The contract is void. But Mr. Branson is owed his damages. It seemed to be over. The social weight of the town was pressing down. A woman who admitted to kissing a man she wasn't married to was indefensible. Then, from the front row, a figure stood up. Wait, it was Pastor Green. The judge peered over his spectacles. Pastor? Green walked to the front of the room. He looked wretched. He looked at Clara, then at Luke, and finally at Silas Vance. I need to speak, Green said. This is highly irregular. The lawyer objected. Let him speak. The judge commanded. Green turned to the crowd. He held his Bible in his hands, twisting the leather cover. I have preached about the sanctity of reputation, Green said, his voice struggling against the noise of the rain. I told Luke Miller that a woman's reputation is like glass. He looked at Clara. But I fear I have been looking through a glass darkly. He took a deep breath. I was on the road that day, Green said, returning from a baptism in the next county. I was on the ridge, miles past the arroyo. I saw the wagon train. He looked at Silas. They were moving fast. They were making camp for the night. I rode down to offer a prayer. I spoke to Mr. Vance. I asked him if everyone had come through the storm safely. The room was deathly silent, save for the rain. And Mr. Vance told me, yes, Pastor, we made good time. Not a soul missing. Silas Vance went white. He didn't search, Green said, his voice rising. He didn't call her name. He told me everyone was safe. He lied. He lied to a man of God, and he lied to this court. He knew she was gone, and he didn't care, because he still had the trunks. The pastor looked at Branson. And you, sir, you knew it too. You were standing right there. The truth hung in the room, naked and ugly. The veneer of respectability that Branson and Silas had worn was stripped away, leaving only greed and cowardice. Judge Calloway sat back in his chair. He looked at Silas Vance with an expression of pure disgust. He picked up his gavel. He didn't bang it. He just held it. The claim of Mr. Branson is dismissed, the judge said. His voice was gravel. There is no valid contract when one party acts in bad faith. You purchased a person, Mr. Branson. And the law of this territory does not look kindly on men who treat wives like cattle. He turned to Silas. As for you, sir, I cannot hang a man for cowardice. I cannot hang a man for being a poor excuse for a father. But I can tell you this, if you ever step foot in my court again, I will find a reason to put you in irons. You are a disgrace. The judge looked at Clara. Miss Clara, you are of age. You are free of this man's guardianship. You are free to go where you please, and with whom you please. And if anyone in this town has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. He slammed the gavel down. It cracked like a gunshot. Case closed. The room erupted into chaos. Luke was at Clara's side in a second. He didn't touch her, but he stood close, a shield against the noise. Let's go, he said. They turned to leave. The crowd parted differently this time. There was no judgment in the eyes of the people. There was shock. There was shame. Men took off their hats as Clara passed. They walked out the double doors and into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the dusty street into a river of mud. It was cold and clean. Clara lifted her face to it, letting the water wash away the heat of the courtroom. You did it, Luke said, his voice rough. We did it, she corrected. They reached the horses, but before they could mount, the doors of the hall banged open behind them. Silas Vance stumbled out, followed by Branson. They were both red-faced, furious, stripped of their power in front of the whole town. You ungrateful little witch! Silas screamed. He slipped on the wet boardwalk but caught himself on the rail. He charged down the steps, splashing into the mud. He ignored Luke. He went for Clara. You ruined me. He shrieked. I will teach you respect. He grabbed Clara's arm, his fingers digging in hard. Luke moved. He didn't draw his gun. He stepped between them, breaking Silas's grip with a sweep of his arm. He shoved Silas back. Not hard, just enough to create distance. It is over. "Vance," Luke said, "go home." Silas, blind with rage and humiliation, swung. It was a clumsy, desperate punch. It caught Luke on the cheekbone. A solid thwack of bone on bone. Clara screamed. Luke's head snapped back. He took a half-step back to steady himself. He raised his hand, his fist clenched, ready to retaliate. He could have broken Silas's jaw. He could have ended him right there, but he didn't. He looked at the older man, panting and pathetic in the rain. He lowered his hand. "I am not like you," Luke said. Silas, expecting a beating, was off balance. He swung again, missed, and his boot found no purchase in the slick mud. His legs went out from under him. He fell hard. He landed on his back in the center of the street, the muck splattering over his fine suit, covering his face in brown slime. He tried to scramble up, slipping again, looking like a flailing beetle. The crowd, watching from the shelter of the porch, began to laugh. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laughter of justice. Silas lay there, panting, the mud soaking into his clothes, realizing he had lost everything. Branson stood on the bottom step. He looked at Luke, then at Clara. He looked at Silas wallowing in the filth. He sneered, a look of pure distaste. "Keep her," he spat at Luke. "She is worth nothing to me now." He turned and stalked away toward the hotel, his dignity in tatters. Luke touched his cheek, wincing slightly. He looked at Clara. "Are you all right?" he asked. Clara looked at her stepfather in the mud. She felt a strange lightness in her chest. The fear was gone. "Yes," she said, "I am." Luke helped her onto her horse. He mounted his own bay. They didn't look back at Silas. They didn't look back at the town. They turned their horses toward the open prairie, toward the rain, toward home. It wasn't a neat ending. The bruises would last. The rumors would linger for years. But as they rode out under the gray, dripping sky, the grip of the past was finally broken. They were free. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the property line, leaving the world washed clean and trembling under a sky of shattered gray clouds. The ride back from Oak Haven had been silent, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the journey in. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a battle fought and finished. The land had changed. The drought that had turned the earth to iron and dust was broken. The prairie breathed. The scent of wet sagebrush, sharp and resinous, filled the air, mixing with the deep, mineral smell of soaked dirt. Puddles shimmered in the deep ruts of the wagon track, reflecting the jagged edges of the retreating storm. The distant hills, usually stark and brown, were veiled in a low, drifting mist that softened their edges, making the harsh territory look almost tender. Luke rode with his hat pulled low, water dripping from the brim onto his slicker. His cheekbone was swelling where Silas had struck him, a knot of purple already forming against the tanned skin, but his shoulders were loose. The tension that had held him rigid for weeks, the fear of the law, the fear of the town, the fear of losing her, had drained away, leaving him hollow but light. Clara rode beside him. She felt the damp cold seeping through her shawl, but she did not shiver. Inside, she felt a strange, steady warmth. She looked at the fence lines as they passed, the wire glistening with raindrops. This was not her prison. It was not her hiding place. It was just a place. And for the first time, she looked at it and wondered if it could be a home. They reached the cabin as the sun began to set, breaking through the western clouds in a sudden, violent display of violet and gold. The light hit the wet roof of the barn, making the wood shine like polished silver. Luke dismounted and walked over to help her down. His hands were gentle on her waist. He held her there for a second longer than necessary, his eyes searching her face. "You are all right?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I am. Go inside," Luke said. "Get warm. I will see to the horses." Clara walked up the steps. She stopped at the door and looked back. Luke was leading the horses into the barn, his limp slightly more pronounced from the fatigue. He looked small against the vast backdrop of the sunset, a solitary figure who had stood between her and the world. She went inside. The cabin was cold and dark. She lit the lamp. the flame sputtering before catching and casting a warm yellow glow over the rough log walls. She looked at the chair where he had slept for 2 weeks. She looked at the narrow bed he had given her. She looked at the stove where they had cooked meager meals in tense silence. It was a poor house. It was a bachelor's shack. But as Clara took off her wet shawl and hung it on the peg, she realized it was the first place she had ever been where she was not a guest and not a servant. She was just Clara. The days that followed were quiet. The adrenaline of the trial faded, leaving them both drained, moving through the hours like people waking from a long, fevered sleep. They did not talk much about what had happened in the courtroom. The words had been said. The truth was out. There was no need to rehash the ugliness of Silas's lies or the shame of the town's judgment. Instead, they focused on the work. The ranch had suffered during their distraction. The storm had knocked down a section of the north fence. The mud in the corral was knee-deep. The roof of the chicken coop had sprung a leak. They worked side by side. The rhythm of the labor was soothing. It was simple. A post needed setting, so they set it. A hinge needed oil, so they oiled it. There was no ambiguity in ranch work, no hidden motives or legal twists. You did the work, and the work was done. Slowly, imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Clara began to claim the space. It started with the curtains. They were old flour sacks that Luke had nailed up years ago, gray with dust and stiff with age. One morning, Clara took them down. She washed them in the boiling pot, scrubbing them until her knuckles were red, and hung them to dry in the sun. When she put them back up, they were crisp and white, letting the light filter in softly. A few days later, she found a patch of bluebells growing near the creek. She picked a handful and placed them in a chipped tin cup on the windowsill. The burst of color was startling against the brown wood. Luke noticed it when he came in for lunch. He stared at the flowers for a long moment, then looked at Clara, but he said nothing. He just ate his stew with a thoughtful expression. She began to take care of his clothes. She gathered his shirts, which he usually washed in the creek, and beat against rocks until they were threadbare, and washed them properly with soap and hot water. She mended the tears in the sleeves. She darned his socks. It was not the forced labor of a wife paying off a debt. It was a quiet offering. It was her way of saying, I am here. I am part of this. Luke, for his part, seemed to be fighting a battle with his own body. The fight with Silas had left him sore, and the accumulation of stress had settled into his joints. He pushed himself hard, working from dawn until dusk, trying to rebuild the time he had lost. One evening, he came in groaning, his hand pressed to his ribs. He sat heavily at the table, his face pale beneath the tan. You are hurting, Clara said. She was at the stove, stirring cornmeal. Just a bruised rib, Luke grunted. Steer kicked me a few years back. The damp weather brings it out. Clara set the spoon down. She walked over to the basin and dipped a cloth in cool water. She wrung it out and walked to him. Sit still, she said. Luke froze as she reached out. She pressed the cool cloth to his cheekbone, where the purple bruise from Silas's ring was fading to a sickly yellow green. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch involuntarily. She moved the cloth down to his neck, wiping away the sweat and grit of the day. Her fingers were gentle, confident. She touched him not with the hesitation of a stranger, but with the familiarity of a woman who knew where the pain lived. You work too hard, she murmured. The fences will wait. Winter is coming, Luke said, his voice rough. Winter does not wait. Clara moved behind him. She put her hands on his shoulders, her thumbs pressing into the knots of muscle at the base of his neck. He flinched at first, then let out a long breath, his head dropping forward. She massaged the tension away, feeling the heat of his skin through his shirt. It was an intimate act, far more intimate than the kiss in the barn. That had been impulse. This was care. This was the tender ache of domesticity. Luke reached up and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough, calloused like rasping wood, but his grip was loose. Thank you, he whispered. Clara stood there in the quiet cabin, the smell of wood smoke and rain around them, and felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness for this scarred, stubborn man. The turning point came a week after the trial. It was evening. The sun was going down in a blaze of glory, painting the clouds in streaks of apricot and rose. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the promise of the coming autumn. The frogs in the creek, revitalized by the rain, were singing a deafening chorus, a wall of sound that vibrated in the chest. Clara finished drying the supper dishes. She looked out the window and saw Luke. He was standing by the corral fence, one boot resting on the bottom rail, his arms crossed on the top. He was watching the horizon, looking at the place where the earth met the sky. She dried her hands on her apron and walked out. The porch boards creaked under her feet. She walked down the steps and across the yard, the dust soft under her shoes. She stood beside him. He didn't turn, but she saw the line of his shoulders relax. He knew she was there. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the light fade from the sky. The creek sounds happy. Clara said softly, "It has water again." Luke said, "Life is simple for a frog. Give it water. It sings. Take it away. It buries itself in the mud and waits. We are not frogs." "Luke, no," he agreed. "We are not." He turned his head to look at her. The fading light caught the gray in his eyes, making them look like polished slate. He looked tired, but the guardedness that usually defined him was gone. "You are free." "Clara," he said, "the judge said it. The town knows it. You have no debt to anyone. Not to Silas, not to Branson, and not to me." Clara looked at him. She saw the question lurking behind the statement. He was giving her the door. He was opening the gate and showing her the road. "I know," she said, "so I have to ask," Luke said, turning fully toward her. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "What do you want?" Clara blinked. "What do I want? Now that you have a choice?" He said, "What do you want to do? If you want to leave, if you want to go east, or find a job in the city, I will sell the roan mare. I will give you the money. I will ride with you to the train station in Cheyenne. I will help you start fresh." He spoke the words quickly, as if he had rehearsed them, as if he needed to get them out before he lost the nerve. Clara looked at the horizon. She thought about the city. She thought about paved streets and brick buildings. She thought about a life where no one knew her name, where she was just a face in the crowd. It would be safe. It would be easy. Then she looked at the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, the white curtains in the window, the patch of bluebells. She looked at Luke. She saw the way his hands gripped the rim of his hat. She saw the hope he was trying to crush because he didn't think he deserved it. "I do not want to go to the city," she said. Luke let out a breath. "Okay, then what? I want to know what you want." "Luke," she said. "You. Not the man who saves strays. The man who lives here." Luke looked down at his boots. He stayed silent for a long time. The frogs filled the quiet. "I want you," he said finally. The words were plain, unadorned. He looked up, and his gaze was intense enough to burn. "I do not want a housekeeper. Clara, I do not want a cook. I do not want a woman I won in a fight or bought with a contract. I want a partner. I want someone who knows how hard this land is and stays anyway. I want the woman who stood up in that courtroom and told them all to go to hell." He took a step closer, stopping just inches from her. "I want to wake up and see you. I want to hear you laugh. I want to know that when I come in from the cold, you are there. Not because you have to be, but because you want to be." Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment the rest of her life began. She thought of the flood, the cold, black water, the terror of being thrown away. And then the strong hand grabbing her arm, the warmth of the slicker, the soup on the stove, the respect in his eyes when he told the deputy to get off his land. She stepped closer. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the heavy, steady thud of it. "I have spent my whole life being told what I was worth," Clara whispered. "I was worth a dowry. I was worth a debt. I was worth a scandal." She looked up into his eyes. "But with you, I am just Clara." She leaned her forehead against his chest. "I choose this. Luke, I choose the dust. I choose the wind. And I choose you." Luke dropped his hat. It hit the dust unheeded. His arms went around her, pulling her in tight. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in like a drowning man finding air. "Clara!" he groaned. He held her with a desperate strength, as if he were trying to fuse her body to his, to make sure she was real, to make sure she wouldn't vanish like the mist. They walked back to the cabin in the twilight, his arm around her shoulders, her arm around his waist. Inside, the lamp was burning low. Luke bolted the door. It was a symbolic gesture. The world was out there, but they were in here. He turned to her. The air in the room changed. It wasn't the charged, frantic electricity of the barn. It was deeper, heavier. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. Clara covered his hand with hers. "I have never been more sure." He kissed her. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. It tasted of promise. There was no urgency, no frantic grasping. They had time. They had all the time in the world. He pulled her closer, his hands moving down her back, pressing her against him. Clara felt the hardness of his body, the strength of him, and for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely safe. There was no fear in this touch. There was no taking. There was only giving. They moved toward the narrow bed in the corner. The shadows danced on the walls, softening the rough edges of the room. Luke paused, looking at her in the dim light. He treated her like she was made of fine china, precious and rare. He unbuttoned her cuffs, his fingers brushing the healed scars on her wrists. He kissed the skin there, a silent apology for the ropes that had bound her, a silent promise that she would never be bound again. Clara unbuttoned his shirt, revealing the map of scars on his chest and shoulders. She kissed the white line on his neck, the mark of his old war. She kissed the bruise on his cheek. They came together in the quiet dark. The only sounds, the rustle of the sheets and the soft intakes of breath. It was an act of reclamation. Clara reclaimed her body from the men who had treated it as currency. Luke reclaimed his heart from the solitude that had turned it to stone. It was not a conquest. It was a homecoming. The weeks turned into months. The autumn came in gold and brown, the cottonwoods turning to torches of yellow against the blue sky. The town of Oakhaven did not embrace them overnight. Prejudice is a stubborn weed. It takes time to pull it out, but curiosity is a powerful force. It started with Mr. Henderson, a rancher from the valley over. He rode up one day, hat in hand, claiming he needed to buy a calf to replace one he had lost to wolves. Luke knew Henderson had plenty of calves, but he didn't say anything. They made the deal on the porch. Clara brought out coffee. Henderson drank it, looked at Clara, and nodded respectfully. "That is fine coffee. Ma'am," he said, "word spread. The sky didn't fall on the Miller Ranch. The earth didn't open up and swallow the sinners." Then came Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife. She drove her buggy out to buy eggs, claiming Luke's hens laid the best shells. She looked at the white curtains. She looked at the clean floor. She looked at Clara, who was wearing a new dress she had sewn herself, blue as the sky. "You have made this place decent, Mrs." Gable sniffed, which was as close as she would ever get to a compliment. They were small victories. A nod on the street, a tipped hat. The whispers changed from scandal to grudging respect. They saw Luke and Clara working side by side in the fields. They saw them riding together, sitting close. They saw a connection that was dignified and quiet. One night, sitting by the fire, Luke spread a piece of paper on the table. "We need to dig a new well," he said, drawing a circle, deeper this time, near the north pasture. Clara looked at the drawing. "And we need to add a room," she said. Luke looked up. "A room?" Clara nodded. "The cabin is too small. If we're going to expand the herd, we will need to hire a hand come spring. He will need a bunk, and—" She hesitated, then smiled. "And I was thinking, there are children in town who cannot read. Their parents are too busy working the land. I was thinking, maybe I could teach them, just a few hours a week. Here." Luke looked at her. He saw the light in her eyes. She wanted to take the pain of her past, the isolation, the silence, and turn it into a voice for others. "A schoolroom," Luke said, testing the word. "Is it a crazy idea?" she asked. Luke smiled. A slow, wide smile that made him look 10 years younger. "I think it is a fine idea. We will build it on the south side. Get the morning sun." The first snow of the year fell in late November. It was a dusting, fine as sugar, coating the world in white. That evening, just before the sun went down, Clara put on her coat. "Walk with me?" she asked. Luke put on his hat and followed her. She didn't head for the barn. She headed for the creek. They walked down the slope, their boots crunching in the frosty grass. The air was biting cold, clean and sharp. They reached the bank of the wash, the place where the wagon had crossed, the place where the water had roared. Now, the creek was calm. A thin ribbon of clear water trickled over the stones, ice forming at the edges. The cottonwood tree where Luke had pulled her out still leaned over the bank, its bare branches scratching the sky. Clara stood at the water's edge. She looked at the rocks. She looked at the path the flood had taken. "It looks so small now," she said softly. Luke stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "It is just water," he said. Clara reached down and touched the icy surface of the creek. She didn't tremble. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke tightened his hold on her. "You thank me every day." "Clara, you do not have to—" "I am not thanking you for saving me," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "I am thanking you for catching me. There is a difference." Luke looked down at her face, framed by the wool collar of her coat. Her cheeks were pink with the cold. Her eyes were bright. "You pulled me out too, Clara," he said, his voice husky. "I was drowning in this place. I was drowning in bitterness. I was a ghost in my own house until you woke me up." He kissed her forehead. We saved each other. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep, velvet blue. One by one, the stars began to appear. First the evening star, bright and lonely in the west. Then the others, a million pinpricks of light piercing the darkness. The Milky Way unfurled across the heavens, a river of light to match the river of water at their feet. The wind blew across the plains, cold and wild. It was a harsh land. It would always be a harsh land. There would be blizzards. There would be droughts. There would be wolves and sickness and hard years. But as Clara and Luke stood together in the dark, arms wrapped around each other, watching the stars wheel overhead, they knew they could weather it. Their love had been born in the mud. It had been tested by fire and lies. It was not a fragile thing. It was as sturdy as the cottonwood roots, as enduring as the rock. It was a shelter, and it was enough. Thank you, dear reader, for journeying with Clara and Luke through the dust, the flood, and the redemption of the American West. It has been a pleasure to weave this tale of survival and love for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending in the comments. Did they find the justice they deserved? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.